A loon calls across a lake at 5 in the morning, and the sound carries so far over the flat water that it seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Mist sits on the surface. A cabin dock creaks, somewhere a screen door bangs, and someone's grandfather is already out there with a coffee thermos and a fishing rod, not expecting to catch anything, not really needing to. This is the picture. It's on the license plate. It's in the tourism ads. It's the first thing anyone who has never been to Minnesota already believes about the place. Before they arrive, land of 10,000 lakes, land of loons and walleye, and people so relentlessly polite they'll apologize to a chair they just bumped into. It's a real picture. Nothing about it is fake, but it's also the smallest possible version of what's actually here. And the part that gets left out isn't some hidden cave system or a cryptid in the woods. It's under the dock. It's under the boat. It's under the water itself. And it is far, far older than anyone standing on that shoreline has ever been told. There are two things hiding under that picture, not one, and they don't arrive on the same time scale. One of them is written into rock nearly as old as the planet itself. The other is still being decided this year in permit hearings and courtrooms most of the country has never heard of, by people whose grandparents dug the ore that built the state everyone else only sees on a postcard. Both of them start in the same place, underneath the loon. Start with the number on the plate, 10,000 lakes. It sounds like a nice round marketing figure, and that's exactly what it was when the state slapped it onto license plates in 1950, a slogan built to sell postcards and fishing trips. The real count, once the Department of Natural Resources sat down and actually measured, depends entirely on where you draw the line. If a lake has to be at least 10 acres to count, Minnesota has something closer to 11,800. If you count every puddle, pond, and beaver flowage big enough to show up on a map, the number climbs past 14,000. The state is quietly, comfortably, off by a fair margin on its own headline number, and almost nobody who has ever bought a t-shirt with a loon on it knows that. It's a small crack, and on its own it wouldn't be worth mentioning. It's just the first one. Follow it down, and the cracks get a lot more interesting, because the actual story isn't about how many lakes there are. It's about what they're sitting on, and about how much of the state that image quietly leaves out of the frame entirely. Because here's a second crack sitting right next to the first one, and it's a geographic one rather than a numerical one. The lake country that fills every tourism brochure, the deep, clear, forested lakes people picture when they hear the word Minnesota, mostly belongs to the northern and central third of the state. Drive southwest instead, toward Worthington or Pipestone, and the land flattens out into corn and soybean fields running to the horizon, cut by slow, muddy rivers instead of clear lakes. Because that stretch of Minnesota sits inside what used to be an enormous glacial lake of its own. One so large it makes the modern lake count look small by comparison. The postcard picked one region out of a state that actually contains 3 or 4 distinct landscapes stitched together, and it picked the prettiest one to represent the whole thing. That's not dishonest exactly. It's just incomplete. The same way a single photograph of a person's best angle is incomplete. And the rest of this is mostly an attempt to widen the frame. Drive 2 hours southwest of the Twin Cities instead, out past the cornfields, to a stretch of exposed rock along the Minnesota River near a small town called Morton. There's a roadside quarry there that most people driving through wouldn't look at twice. Gray rock, streaked and banded. Nothing that screams for attention next to 60-mile-an-hour traffic. Geologists call it the Morton Gneiss. And when they finally got a reliable way to date it, using the decay of radioactive isotopes locked inside microscopic zircon crystals scattered through the rock, the number that came back was staggering in the plainest sense of the word, roughly 3.5 billion years, not 3,500, not 3.5 million, 3.5 billion with a B, which makes it one of the oldest pieces of exposed rock anywhere on the surface of the Earth, sitting in a state whose entire public identity is built around water that's been there for maybe 12,000 years. The lake is a toddler. The rock underneath it has been sitting there since before there was oxygen to breathe. For comparison, the same dating method applied to rock samples. The Apollo astronauts carried back from the moon puts the oldest lunar material at a little over 4 billion years, meaning a chunk of gray roadside gneiss outside a small Minnesota farm town is closer in age to actual moon rock than it is to the dinosaurs. The dating method itself is worth a moment, because it's not a guess dressed up as science. Zircon crystals, when they form inside cooling magma, lock a small amount of uranium into their structure, and that uranium decays into lead at a fixed, extremely well-measured rate, a rate that doesn't speed up or slow down based on heat, pressure, or anything else geologists have ever managed to throw at it in a lab. Measure the ratio of uranium left to lead accumulated inside one of those crystals, and you're reading a clock that started ticking the moment the rock cooled from liquid to solid. It's the same basic method, applied to different elements with different decay rates, that lets scientists date everything from a 200-year-old artifact to a meteorite older than the Earth itself. When that clock got applied to the zircons inside the Morton gneiss, it came back consistent, from multiple labs, multiple decades apart, landing on virtually the same age each time. Geologists don't just trust one clock either. The same samples have also been checked against a completely separate radioactive pairing, samarium decaying into neodymium, which runs on a different physical process entirely and would be expected to drift out of agreement with the uranium lead result if either method were flawed. Instead, the two independent clocks landed close enough to each other that most working geologists treat the Morton gneiss's age as one of the more solidly confirmed numbers in North American geology, not a single measurement taken on faith. It helps to actually feel that number instead of just hearing it. If you compress the entire history of Earth into a single calendar year, starting January 1st at the planet's formation, that Morton gneiss rock would have already been sitting there since around the third week of February. Multicellular animals with anything resembling a body plan don't show up until the middle of December. Humans, all of recorded human history, arrive in the last few seconds before midnight on December 31st. The rock a fisherman drives past on his way to a Minnesota River access point has been sitting in that exact spot for something like 11 months of that compressed year before the first animal with a spine had even evolved. That's not a fun fact. That's the actual floor this state is built on, in the plainest, most literal sense of bedrock there is. The ancient gneiss near Morton, strange as it is, isn't even the part of Minnesota's deep past that shaped the most human history. Head north instead, up toward the Iron Range, and the rock changes character entirely. It goes reddish, banded in thin alternating layers of dark iron oxide and pale, glassy silica, sometimes shot through with a deep jasper red where the iron content runs highest, like something was deliberately laminated over an enormous span of time. That rock has a name too, the Biwabik Iron Formation, along with its cousins, the Gunflint and Trommeld formations, stacked across the Mesabi, Vermilion, and Cuyuna iron ranges of northeastern Minnesota. And the story of how that banded rock actually formed connects directly, mechanically, to one of the single most important events in the entire history of life on this planet. Roughly 2 billion years ago, give or take a few hundred million, the oceans covering this part of the world were full of dissolved iron, not iron ore sitting on the seafloor. Iron dissolved right into the water itself, the way salt dissolves, invisible, because in a world with almost no free oxygen, iron stays soluble. Then something changed. Cyanobacteria, tiny photosynthetic organisms that had been quietly multiplying in the shallow seas for a few 100 million years already, were pumping out oxygen as a waste product of turning sunlight into energy. For a very long stretch of Earth's history, that oxygen had nowhere to go. It got absorbed almost as fast as it was produced, soaked up by exposed rock on land, by dissolved iron in seawater, by anything that could react with it. Scientists call this stretch the Great Oxidation Event, and one of its most visible physical fingerprints preserved in rock all over the planet is exactly what's sitting under the Mesabi Range. As the oxygen finally started to build up faster than the ocean could absorb it, that dissolved iron reacted with it and rusted right there in the water, and sank to the seafloor in thin, repeating layers as oxygen levels rose and fell in cycles that geologists still argue about the exact rhythm of. Layer after layer after layer, sometimes measured in fractions of an inch each, built up across millions of years, banding the rock the same way tree rings band a trunk. That banding is the literal, physical residue of the planet learning to breathe. Geologists pin down roughly when it happened in this specific rock, the same way they date a layer cake. Thin bands of volcanic ash sometimes settled into the iron formation between one rusting cycle and the next, and those ash layers carry their own datable zircon crystals, laid down all at once during a single eruption, rather than accumulating slowly, like the rusting itself. Dating the ash gives a hard, independent timestamp pinned directly into the middle of the iron layers around it, effectively a bookmark pressed into the rock while it was still forming. That's a hard thing to hold in your head all at once. The iron ore that built entire towns in northeastern Minnesota, that got loaded onto ships and turned into the steel frame of half of American industry, is fossilized evidence of the exact geological moment that made animal life possible in the first place. Not evidence in the sense of a fossil bone or a footprint. Evidence in the sense that the rock itself is a direct chemical record of the ocean rusting as it filled with the gas every animal on Earth, including every person who has ever fished a Minnesota lake, now depends on to stay alive. The state's entire 20th century industrial economy was built on quarrying up the rust left over from the birth of breathable air. Nobody puts that on a license plate. People had been living across this land for thousands of years before any of this geology got a formal name, long before the rust was ever called ore. The Dakota and, later, the Ojibwe, who called themselves Anishinaabe, moved west and north over generations of migration, trade, and conflict with other nations and with European fur traders. And they knew this country's water, its wild rice beds, its seasonal rhythms of fishing and hunting and gathering, in a depth no survey crew would match for centuries. A series of treaties in 1837, 1854, and 1855 ceded large stretches of what's now Minnesota to federal ownership, but each of them explicitly preserved the signing band's rights to hunt, fish, and gather across that same ceded territory. Rights the bands never surrendered even as the land itself changed hands. Those rights weren't just words on paper. In 1999, the case reached the United States Supreme Court, Minnesota, against the Mille Lacs Band of Chippewa Indians, and the court ruled that the 1837 treaty's hunting, fishing, and gathering rights remained legally binding more than a century and a half after they were signed, regardless of Minnesota's later statehood. That ruling still governs the ground being fought over in the 21st century because the territory those rights cover overlaps almost exactly with the mineral-rich rock at the center of the modern mining fight. Long before any of that iron got a price tag, this same ground was already the center of the first extraction economy Europeans built here. And it wasn't ore, it was fur. Starting in the 1600s and running for the better part of 2 centuries, French and later British trading companies, most prominently the Northwest Company, ran a fur trade empire out of a post at Grand Portage, right on the shore of Lake Superior near what's now the Canadian border. French-Canadian canoemen called voyageurs paddled birch bark canoes loaded with trade goods and furs along exactly the same chain of interconnected lakes that now make up the boundary waters, portaging their loads on their backs between one lake and the next. The same physical labor modern paddlers now pay outfitters to help them do for fun. Ojibwe trappers and hunters supplied the overwhelming majority of the actual furs, mostly beaver, prized in Europe for felt hats, and the trade reshaped both economies and alliances across the whole region for generations. It ended the way most extraction economies in this story end. The resource thinned out, as beaver were trapped faster than they could repopulate. And then fashion itself moved on, as European hatmakers shifted toward silk, and the entire trade collapsed within a few decades, leaving behind little more than place names, a scatter of archaeological sites, and a national park named directly after the men who paddled it. Voyageurs National Park, established in 1975 along the Canadian border, is one of the only national parks in the country reachable mainly by boat, built around a chain of 4 large connected lakes, Rainy Lake, Kabetogama, Namakan, and Sand Point, that formed the actual highway the fur trade ran on, and most Americans who could name Yellowstone or Yosemite without hesitation have never heard of it. Fur wasn't the last extraction economy to arrive before iron either. Starting in the 1870s and accelerating hard through the 1890s, logging companies moved into northern Minnesota's forests for the white and red pines standing there, trees that had been growing for centuries, some more than 4 feet across at the base. Lumberjacks felled entire forests, floated the logs downriver each spring to sawmills in towns like Stillwater and Minneapolis, and within roughly 30 years had cut through the overwhelming majority of the state's old-growth pine, leaving behind vast stretches of cutover land littered with dry slash, the branches and treetops nobody wanted, piled everywhere across the landscape. That slash turned out to be close to the most dangerous fuel a forest can hold. On the 1st of September, 1894, a combination of drought, high wind, and sparks from passing trains ignited that slash near the town of Hinckley, and the resulting firestorm moved faster than anyone could outrun on foot, killing more than 400 people in a matter of hours, some of whom survived only by wading into a gravel pit or standing in a shallow pond while the fire burned past on both sides. 24 years later, in October of 1918, almost the identical combination of drought, wind, and cutover slash ignited again near Cloquet and Moose Lake, killing several hundred more people and burning through an area many times the size of the Hinckley fire. Both disasters trace back to the same industrial practice: strip a forest for profit, leave the flammable leftovers on the ground, and wait for the wrong combination of weather. Trains carried survivors out of both fires toward Duluth, and in the aftermath of the 1894 disaster, investigators traced the ignition directly to sparks thrown by railroad locomotives working through slash the logging companies had left piled beside the tracks. Evidence solid enough that courts eventually held the railroads financially liable for damages. One of the earliest instances of an American industry being made to pay in court for a wildfire it had helped create the fuel for. The cutover land left behind by the logging boom was, for years afterward, marketed to hopeful farmers as cheap, fertile country, when in reality it was often thin, rocky, and poorly suited to row crops, and a good number of the families who tried to farm it failed within a generation, partly in response to the disaster of the cutover, and partly to prevent another Hinckley. The federal government established the Superior National Forest in 1909, deliberately setting aside cutover and remaining forest land for long-term management instead of one more round of unregulated cutting, a conservation response born directly out of a fire that killed hundreds of people. The forest that exists today across the Boundary Waters and the rest of the Arrowhead region is almost entirely second growth, trees that have regrown over the last century on land that was clear-cut once already, standing on soil that in some places never fully recovered. There's one more layer to the logging story worth knowing, because it says something about how thoroughly this state's public image has always been built, rather than simply found. The giant lumberjack Paul Bunyan and his blue ox babe, the statues towns like Bemidji and Brainerd, have built their tourism around for the better part of a century, aren't old frontier folklore that lumberjacks actually told each other around a campfire, or at least not mostly. Most of the specific tales now considered classic Paul Bunyan stories were written and published starting around 1914 by an advertising writer named William Lawfed, working for the Red River Lumber Company, as promotional pamphlets meant to build a friendly, larger-than-life brand for the company's timber operations. The folk hero standing 40 feet tall next to a giant ox in more than one Minnesota town today is, at his origin, a corporate mascot for the same industry that burned down Hinckley, later adopted so completely into regional identity that almost nobody who takes a photo next to the statue knows that part of the history. Bemidji built its own Paul Bunyan and Babe statue in 1937, one of the earliest and most photographed examples of the giant roadside statues that would later become an entire genre of American highway tourism, years before anyone called that kind of attraction kitsch. Even the folklore has an extraction economy hiding underneath it. European and American prospectors didn't know any of the geology either, not at first. They knew there was iron somewhere up in that country because trace deposits had turned up for decades, but nobody had located the real body of ore until 1890, when a group of brothers named Merritt, out looking for gold near a spot that would come to be called Mountain Iron, instead found soft, red, almost soil-like ore sitting close enough to the surface that a person could practically scoop it with a shovel. It wasn't the hard, dense, crystalline ore anyone expected to find. It looked wrong, more like reddish dirt than rock. And that's exactly why it had been missed for so long by prospectors who kept walking past it looking for something that matched their idea of ore. Accounts from the time describe the brothers testing a handful of the reddish material right there on the spot, rubbing it between their fingers, unconvinced at first that dirt this soft could possibly be worth anything, before deciding it was worth digging a test pit anyway. That instinct to check the unglamorous-looking material instead of walking past it is the entire discovery in miniature. The Merritts and their partners, later nicknamed the Seven Iron Men, opened the first mine on what would become the Mesabi Range, and within a decade the place had transformed from scattered logging camps into one of the busiest mining districts on the continent. By some estimates, this single strip of ancient rusted rock has produced close to half of all the iron ore ever mined in the United States, a startling share for one county-sized district to carry on its own. Some of the prospectors searching for that ore before the Merritts found it were using a surprisingly simple piece of equipment, a dip needle, essentially a sensitive magnetic compass, mounted to swing vertically instead of horizontally, which would visibly tilt and dance whenever it passed near a large enough body of iron-rich rock. Because banded iron formation carries a strong magnetic signature, a prospector walking a grid pattern across the countryside with a dip needle in hand could map out where Ray was likely sitting underground without digging a single test pit, decades before anyone had access to modern geophysical survey equipment. It's a low-tech method that worked because the rock itself, magnetized by its own iron content, was essentially advertising its location the whole time, to anyone who thought to bring the right instrument. The Merritt's own story didn't end well, and it's worth knowing the ending because it undercuts any temptation to read this as a simple rags-to-riches tale. Opening and equipping a mine took far more capital than the family had, and they borrowed heavily to build the railroad and docks needed to actually ship their ore to market. When the panic of 1893 hit, a nationwide financial crash, the Merritt's creditors called in their loans. And within a couple of years, the family that had discovered the richest iron deposit in American history lost control of it almost entirely. Most of it passing into the hands of financier John D. Rockefeller's business interests. Rockefeller sold his Mesabi holdings a few years later to a new steel conglomerate assembled by J.P. Morgan, which absorbed Andrew Carnegie's steel operations along with the Mesabi ore fields to form United States Steel in 1901, the first corporation in American history valued at over $1 billion. The Rock, a family of Minnesota prospectors found by accident, chasing a gold rumor with a dip needle, ended up as raw material inside the largest corporate merger the country had ever seen, while the family that found it walked away with comparatively little to show for it. The boom pulled in workers from everywhere: Finnish loggers and miners, Slovenian and Croatian families, Italians, Serbians, Swedes, all funneled into new company towns that sprang up along the ore body almost overnight. Towns like Hibbing, Chisholm, Eveleth, Virginia, and Biwabik, most of them platted, built, and largely owned by the mining companies that employed everyone living in them. Life in those towns was brutal in ways that don't survive well in a nostalgic postcard. 12-hour shifts underground or in open pits, company housing, company stores, and mining companies that fought hard against any organizing among the workforce. Miners walked out in 1907 and again in 1916. The second strike led in part by organizers from the industrial workers of the world, and both were met with private guards, evictions, and in some cases, outright violence against strikers. Company control over those towns went beyond wages and hours, too. In the early years, many mining companies paid part of wages in scrip, credit redeemable only at company-owned stores, which meant a family could work a full month and still owe money back to the same company that employed them once rent and groceries were subtracted. Companies also had a well-documented habit of deliberately mixing workers from different immigrant backgrounds within the same crews and boarding houses. A strategy meant to make organizing harder, since a workforce that didn't share a common language had a much harder time coordinating a walkout. It mostly worked for a while. Union organizing on the range moved in fits and starts for decades, gaining real, lasting strength only once the United Steelworkers established a durable presence across the mines in the 1940s. The 1916 strike, involving thousands of workers across the range, grew out of anger at the so-called contract system, which paid miners based on how much ore they moved rather than by the hour, a system companies could quietly manipulate to squeeze more work out of the same pay. Organizers, including Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, one of the era's most prominent labor speakers, traveled to the range to support the strikers, and the walkout eventually forced mining companies to abandon the contract system in favor of a standard daily wage, though it would take years more and further organizing before an 8-hour workday became the norm across the industry in the 1920s. This wasn't a gentle chapter. It was the same raw industrial conflict playing out across coal country and steel country all over the United States at the time, just relocated to a strip of ancient rusted rock in the North Woods. And that history is a big reason so many towns up there still carry Finnish bakeries, Slovenian halls, and Serbian Orthodox churches sitting a few blocks apart from each other, a map of the boom laid out in brick and steeple. Finnish immigrants in particular built their own parallel institutions almost immediately: cooperative stores, temperance halls, and in Duluth, an entire labor college called the Work People's College that trained a generation of organizers in languages the mining company's own foremen often couldn't follow. One more example of communities meeting a hostile system by building their own version of it, rather than waiting for permission to organize. It's worth saying plainly that the postcard version of this state isn't a lie sitting on top of the truth. It's a real, separate economy running in parallel with the mining one, and it's worth taking seriously on its own terms, rather than treating it only as a footnote to the mining story. The resort country around Brainerd and the thousands of small fishing and family resorts scattered across the northern lake belt anchor a large seasonal tourism economy, drawing visitors from across the Midwest every summer for exactly the dock and loon experience the license plate promises. And that industry pays real wages to real people whose entire livelihood depends on the postcard staying true. The mistake was never in loving the picture. It was in assuming the picture was the whole state. And then there's Hibbing, which has maybe the single strangest fact in this entire story, and almost nobody outside Minnesota has ever heard it. The Hull Rust Mahoning Mine, which locals still call the Grand Canyon of the North, kept growing and growing and growing because the ore body underneath the original town of Hibbing turned out to be enormous. So starting in the early 1920s, the mining company didn't just dig around the town, it moved the town. Buildings were loaded onto rollers and hauled piece by piece about 2 miles south, so the pit could keep expanding into the space the old town had occupied. Houses, a hotel, even a hospital, relocated over the better part of a decade, so a hole in the ground could get bigger. There is a version of Hibbing today, and there was a different Hibbing sitting a few miles north of it that no longer exists because the rock underneath it was worth more than the town built on top of it. Somewhere under the open pit that tourists now photograph from a viewing platform, there used to be a main street. The pit itself now stretches for miles, over a mile wide in places and several 100 feet deep, big enough that the overlook posts a warning for drivers, the way a road might warn about an oncoming lake. The waste rock and processed tailings from a century of digging that pit, and others like it, have been piled into basins and stockpiles large enough to show up clearly in satellite photos of the region. Gray-red mounds sitting beside forest and lake country so green it looks like it belongs to a different state entirely. The two landscapes touching each other directly with no buffer in between. Chisholm, a few miles away, leans into the mining identity even more directly, home to the Minnesota Discovery Center's Mining Museum and to the Iron Man Memorial, a towering statue of a generic miner overlooking the pits, built in the 1980s specifically so the range could tell its own story, on its own terms, instead of leaving that job to a license plate designed 3 hours south in St. Paul. Hibbing carries one more piece of trivia worth knowing here, because it quietly proves how much this region has exported to the rest of the nation without ever advertising where it came from. A young Robert Zimmerman grew up on the streets laid out after the town's relocation before he left for Minneapolis and then New York and reinvented himself as Bob Dylan. A little further south in Grand Rapids, a toddler named Francis Gumm was born to a family running a small vaudeville theater, years before Hollywood renamed her Judy Garland. Neither fact has much to do with iron ore directly, but both happened in towns that exist in their current form. Because of it, in Hibbing's case, quite literally on ground, a mining company decided was worth relocating an entire town over. Minneapolis produced its own outsized musical export a couple of generations later, when Prince Rogers Nelson built an entire recognizable sound out of a music scene clustered around clubs like First Avenue, proving a cold, mid-sized Midwestern city could shape mainstream American pop music as thoroughly as Detroit or Memphis ever did, without borrowing either city's playbook. Minnesota also produces a wildly disproportionate share of the country's competitive hockey talent for its population, a fact tied directly back to those same brutal winters. Frozen ponds and outdoor rinks function as free, ready-made practice ice for months at a time, and the state's high school hockey tournament regularly draws crowds that rival a professional game, hockey, a sport. The cold built almost as an accident of climate, the same way it built Minnesota nice. Charles Lindbergh grew up along the Mississippi in the small town of Little Falls, decades before he became the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic, and his boyhood home there is now a historic site. And one more example of a figure who left this state and became internationally famous doing something that had nothing to do with lakes, lumber, or iron ore at all. That pit, and others like it across the range, fed something enormous. When the United States entered the Second World War, its steel mills needed iron ore at a scale nothing had ever demanded before, and the Mesabi Range carried an outsized share of that load, commonly estimated at somewhere close to 2/3 of all the iron ore mined domestically during the war years. Ships, tanks, artillery shells, the steel skeletons of an entire war economy, a huge amount of it traced straight back to that reddish, banded, 2-billion-year-old rock in northeastern Minnesota. It's hard to accept that a chemical event in the ocean, happening long before anything with eyes existed to see it, ended up shaping the outcome of a global war roughly 2 billion years later. Deep time doesn't usually reach forward and touch something that specific. The war years were also close to the peak of an era, because the richest, easiest ore, the kind you could practically shovel straight into a rail car, was running out. By the 1950s, the natural high-grade ore that had made the Merits rich was getting thin, and the range faced something close to an existential crisis. The rock that was left, a hard, low-grade material called taconite, contained plenty of iron, but it was locked into the rock in a form too fine and too dispersed to ship and smelt the old way. For decades, taconite had been treated as waste rock, something you dug through to get to the good stuff. If nobody figured out how to use it, an entire regional economy, dozens of towns, tens of thousands of jobs, was going to collapse along with the ore. And it was going to collapse in the same decade that other American mining and manufacturing towns were just starting to feel the first signs of that same squeeze. The person most credited with solving that problem is a metallurgist named Edmund Davis, who spent close to 50 years at the University of Minnesota's Mines Experiment Station working on exactly this. His process crushed the hard taconite rock into a fine powder, fine enough that the iron oxide grains could be separated from the surrounding silica using magnets, since the iron responds to a magnetic field and the waste rock doesn't. The concentrated iron powder was then rolled with a binder into small, hard, marble-sized pellets and baked until they hardened enough to survive shipping. Those pellets could go straight into a blast furnace, actually more efficiently in some ways than the old lumpy natural ore had been because their size and iron content were far more consistent. It sounds almost boring to describe that plainly, a grinding, sorting, and rolling process, but it saved the range. Without it, the towns built by the Merits and filled by Finnish and Slovenian and Italian families would very likely have hollowed out completely by the 1960s, decades before the rest of America's Rust Belt started having that same conversation about factories closing for good. That's how close it actually came to not happening at all. If Davis's process hadn't worked, or if the university hadn't funded decades of unglamorous, repetitive metallurgical testing with no guaranteed payoff, there's a very real version of this state's history where Hibbing, Chisholm, Eveleth, and Virginia follow the same arc as dozens of other American mining towns that quietly emptied out once the easy ore ran dry, becoming a footnote instead of a functioning region. Nobody watching that research happen in a university lab in the 1930s and 40s could have known it would end up mattering that much. It just did. It helps to actually picture what happens inside a modern taconite plant, because the process itself is stranger and more mechanical than the word processing usually suggests. Trucks the size of a small house hall blasted rock to a primary crusher that reduces boulders to fist-sized chunks in a matter of seconds. From there, the rock passes through a series of grinding mills, rotating drums packed with steel rods or balls that tumble against the ore until it comes out the other end as a powder finer than table flour. That powder passes over a bank of magnetic separators, since the iron oxide in the rock responds to a magnetic field, and the surrounding silica does not, pulling a concentrated iron-rich slurry away from waste rock that gets pumped out to a tailings basin. The concentrated slurry is then rolled on a spinning disc into small green pellets about the size of a marble, still soft enough to crumble in a hand, before those pellets travel through a rotating kiln fired hot enough to harden them into the dense, dark pellets that finally get loaded onto rail cars. Start to finish, a piece of 2-billion-year-old banded rock becomes a shippable pellet of concentrated iron in a matter of hours, inside a building most of the people driving past on the highway outside never once think to look at. Even with the process solved, mining companies weren't going to sink hundreds of millions of dollars into new taconite plants without some certainty that Minnesota wasn't going to tax the investment into the ground the moment it got built. So in 1964, Minnesota voters approved a constitutional amendment, the Taconite Amendment, locking in a stable tax structure specifically for taconite production for years at a stretch, instead of leaving it exposed to whatever the legislature felt like doing that session. It's not a dramatic piece of history. It's a tax amendment. But it's the reason the range still has an active mining industry today instead of becoming a museum piece. And it's a good example of a truth that runs through this whole state's history. The decisions that actually shaped this state weren't made by nature alone. People chose, deliberately, more than once, to keep this particular relationship with the rock alive. Those taconite pellets don't stay on the range. They get loaded onto rail cars, hauled to the docks at Duluth and Two Harbors, and poured into the holds of enormous lake freighters built specifically for one job, hauling bulk ore across the Great Lakes to steel mills downstream. Duluth's harbor is stranger than it looks on a map, too, because ships can sail from there out through the rest of the Great Lakes and down the St. Lawrence Seaway all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. The Duluth Superior Port functions as a genuine seaport, loading and unloading ocean-going cargo, despite sitting more than 2,000 miles from open salt water, deep in the middle of the continent. It's regularly described as the world's furthest inland freshwater seaport, a title that only makes sense once you remember the whole Great Lakes system is, geologically, a chain of basins, connected well enough to let a ship built for the ocean reach a dock in the middle of Minnesota. The range itself is shaped the way it is for a specific, checkable reason, and it's worth pausing on. The Mesabi and Vermilion ranges aren't mountains in the geological sense at all. They're long, low ridges that stand up slightly above the surrounding land because the banded iron formation is simply harder and more erosion-resistant than the softer rock around it. So over hundreds of millions of years of weather wearing the landscape down, the iron-rich rock wore down more slowly and was left standing a little proud of everything around it. A ridge built out of stubbornness rather than uplift. It's worth naming what's actually operating up there right now, too, because iron mining on the range isn't a museum piece frozen in the Merritt era. It's a functioning modern industry with real facilities most people outside Minnesota have never heard the names of. Mintac, near Mountain Iron on the same ground the Merritts first opened, is one of the largest iron ore mines in North America, still operated by United States Steel more than a century after Mesabi Ore first built the company. Hibbing Taconite and United Taconite run other large plants nearby, and North Shore Mining, based at Silver Bay and Babbitt, is the direct successor to Reserve Mining. The same company forced out of dumping into Lake Superior in the 1970s, now running a cleaner operation on the same ground under a different name. Ownership across the range has consolidated over the decades into a smaller number of larger companies, U.S. Steel and Cleveland Cliffs chief among them. But the ore keeps moving, year after year, out of the same ancient rusted formation the Merritts first scratched at with a dip needle. That process itself, back in the 1970s, produced one of the first real environmental fights this region ever had. And it's worth knowing about because it's a direct historical rehearsal for the fight happening right now. A company called Reserve Mining, operating a taconite processing plant at Silver Bay on the North Shore, had been dumping its waste rock, the finely ground leftover material after the iron was pulled out, straight into Lake Superior for decades, at a rate of tens of thousands of tons a day. In the early 1970s, researchers found that the discarded material contained fibers structurally similar to amphibole asbestos, and turbid plumes of it were showing up in the drinking water intakes of towns along the shore, including Duluth. The resulting lawsuit, Reserve Mining Company against the Environmental Protection Agency, dragged through federal courts for years and became one of the longest, most contentious environmental cases in the country at the time, eventually forcing Reserve to build an entirely new on-land disposal site and stop dumping into the lake. It's a case almost nobody outside Minnesota remembers now, but it's proof that the tension between this rock and this water isn't a new invention of the current decade. It's been playing out, on and off, for more than 50 years. Lake Superior itself, the lake all that taconite eventually crosses, deserves more than a cameo, because most people picture it as another pretty blue postcard when it's actually, by a wide margin, the coldest, deepest, and most dangerous of the Great Lakes. A body of water so large it generates its own weather systems, and so cold that a person who goes into it in November has minutes, not hours, before hypothermia takes hold. On the 10th of November, 1975, an ore freighter called the SS Edmund Fitzgerald was crossing Lake Superior loaded with taconite pellets, headed for a steel mill near Detroit, when it ran into one of the worst storms the lake had seen in years. Waves were reported over 25 feet. The ship, more than 700 feet long, went down with its entire crew of 29 men, and to this day nobody knows with full certainty exactly what combination of structural failure, wave action, and navigation error sent it under so fast that it never even had time to send a distress call. It's one of the most thoroughly investigated shipwrecks in American history, and there's still honest disagreement among the people who've studied it about the precise mechanism, whether it was hull damage from grounding earlier that day, a rogue wave sequence, or a hatch cover failure that let water pour in faster than the pumps could handle. What isn't in dispute is what the ship was carrying when it sank. Taconite pellets, dug from that same rusted formation, on their way to become part of the steel skeleton of some building or bridge or car that's probably still standing somewhere right now. The lake that shows up on every North Shore postcard swallowed a ship whole while moving the exact material this entire story has been circling around. The North Shore itself carries one more layer of deep time worth pausing on, because the dramatic black cliffs along that stretch of Lake Superior, the ones tourists photograph at places like Split Rock Lighthouse and Palisade Head, aren't the same rock as the Iron Range at all. They're basalt and rhyolite, hardened lava, left over from an event called the Mid-Continent Rift, roughly 1,100,000,000 years ago, when the middle of the North American continent tried to tear itself apart along a line running roughly from Kansas up through Minnesota and out into what's now Lake Superior. It never finished tearing. The rift stalled, leaving behind a scar filled with cooled lava flows more than a mile thick in places, and Lake Superior sits partly in the low ground that rifting left behind. The same rift, further east across the lake in Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula, also left behind some of the purest native copper deposits ever found anywhere on Earth. Copper metal so concentrated it could be mined and worked without smelting at all. And that's a large share of why indigenous peoples were mining and trading Lake Superior copper across the continent thousands of years before any European crossed the Atlantic. So a single scenic overlook on Highway 61 can put a visitor within view of three completely different chapters of deep time. The almost impossibly old gneiss to the south, the rusted iron formation inland, and the frozen lava scar of a continent that almost split in two, all before the ice ever showed up. Split Rock Lighthouse itself exists because of exactly the kind of danger woven through this whole account. In late November of 1905, a single storm system tore across Lake Superior for 2 straight days, wrecking or damaging close to 30 ships along the shore. One of them, the steel steamer Mataafa, Steosiosti, was trying to reach the safety of Duluth's harbor when the storm forced it back out, and it broke apart on the rocks within sight of the pier, close enough that people gathered on shore could see the wreck and were powerless to reach it until the weather finally eased. Part of the crew survived by holding on through the night in the ship's stern section. Part did not. The disaster, and others like it that same storm, convinced the federal government that this stretch of coast needed a lighthouse, and Split Rock went up 5 years later, in 1910, on a cliff of that same billion-year-old rift rock, precisely because a modern steel ship, radioless and alone in a lake that size, still had almost no chance against the water once the weather turned. Because the ice is the last piece, and it's the piece that finally explains where the actual lakes came from. Everything described so far, the ancient gneiss, the banded iron, the rifted basalt, is old on a timescale that barely makes sense to a human mind. The lakes are almost embarrassingly young by comparison. As recently as somewhere between 12 and 20,000 years ago, depending on the exact spot in the state, massive lobes of glacial ice, part of the same continental ice sheet that buried most of Canada, were sitting directly on top of all of that ancient rock, in places thousands of feet thick. The Superior Lobe pushed down out of the Lake Superior Basin. The Des Moines Lobe crept in from the northwest, all the way down into what's now Iowa. As they finally retreated, dragging and grinding across that Precambrian bedrock, they gouged out thousands of shallow basins, dammed old drainage channels with piles of rock and gravel called moraines, and left behind a landscape pocked with depressions that filled with the meltwater pouring off the retreating ice. Those depressions are the lakes. Every one of them. The glassy water a family paddles across on a July evening sits in a scar the ice cut into rock that had already been sitting there for 2 billion years before the ice ever showed up, and in some spots well past 3 billion. The retreating Des Moines Lobe left something else behind too, something that explains the second crack from the start of this story: the flat farmland stretching across the southwestern and northwestern parts of the state. As the ice finally pulled back for good, meltwater pooled up against the retreating edge and formed an enormous proglacial lake, one that geologists now call Lake Agassiz, covering a huge swath of what's now northwestern Minnesota, eastern North Dakota, and southern Manitoba, far larger than all of the state's modern lakes combined. Lake Agassiz eventually drained away, but it left behind a lakebed so flat and so thick with fine, fertile silt that the region became some of the most productive farmland in North America. That flat expanse is the Red River Valley, and today it grows a huge share of the country's sugar beets, largely through farmer-owned cooperatives like American Crystal Sugar, whose growers work spec land that used to be the floor of a lake bigger than any of the Great Lakes. The postcard shows the loon and the pine trees. It doesn't show the wheat and sugar beet country sitting in the bed of an even bigger lake that vanished before any of the 10,000 were ever counted. That same open, wind-raked prairie has since taken on a newer role too, one the postcard has no room for either. The Buffalo Ridge area of southwestern Minnesota, a low, exposed rise left behind by the same glacial retreat, catches some of the most consistent wind in the entire Midwest, and it's now dotted with hundreds of wind turbines, leased onto farmland the same families have worked for generations. For a lot of those farmers, a turbine lease has become a second, steadier income sitting on top of an unpredictable one. Wind turned into a cash crop on ground that used to sit at the bottom of Lake Agassiz, a landscape adding a fourth extraction economy to the pile, without ever needing to dig anything out of the ground at all. Even the name Minnesota is quietly making the same argument the license plate does. It comes from the Dakota phrase Amnisoda, usually translated as clear water or sky-tinted water, a description of the way certain rivers and lakes here reflect the sky back with an unusual clarity. The water identity was never invented by a tourism board. It's built into the language itself, centuries before anyone printed a slogan onto a piece of stamped metal, which makes it stranger, not less true, that a name describing water sits directly on top of billions of years of rock nobody bothered to name in the same breath. Mesabi, the name of the range itself, comes from an Ojibwe word, Misabe, meaning giant, tied to older stories about a sleeping giant whose shape the low hills of the range were said to resemble long before anyone dug into them looking for iron. There's a third landscape, too, sitting between the northern lake country and the western prairie, one most visitors drive straight through without noticing it's even a distinct thing. Minnesota happens to sit almost exactly on the boundary where the eastern hardwood forest, the tallgrass prairie, and the northern boreal forest all meet and blend into each other, a transition zone ecologists call the tallgrass aspen parkland, a patchwork of prairie openings, aspen groves, and wetland that doesn't look like any one biome cleanly. It exists here because this is close to the edge of where each ecosystem's climate tolerance runs out, and it means a person can drive an hour and pass through three distinct kinds of landscape: prairie giving way to aspen, giving way to spruce bog, without the state line ever coming close. The lake postcard picked the spruce bog. It just never mentioned the other two. There's a fourth landscape tucked into the far southeastern corner of the state, and it's arguably the strangest of all because it's defined by something that never happened here. When the most recent glacier spread across nearly all of Minnesota, a wedge of the far southeast, roughly the bluff country around Winona, Rochester, and the Root River Valley, sat just outside their reach, part of a larger region called the Driftless Area, that also spans slices of Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois. Because the ice never leveled it, that corner of the state kept its older, pre-glacial shape. Steep limestone bluffs, deep river valleys, and cave systems instead of the flat, lake-pocked terrain everywhere else. The bedrock down there is limestone and sandstone laid down by shallow seas hundreds of millions of years ago. Riddled with the kind of cracked, porous rock geologists call karst, and it comes with its own quiet cost. Rain and snowmelt, carrying nitrogen fertilizer off nearby farm fields, can travel straight down through that fractured limestone into the drinking water aquifer below, almost unfiltered. And elevated nitrate levels in private wells across the karst region have been a documented public health concern for the small towns sitting on top of it for years. It's a completely different mechanism from the sulfide risk up on the range. A different rock, a different industry, a different watershed, but it's the same underlying pattern. Water that looks clean, carrying a cost that isn't visible from the road. All of that water, the lakes, the prairie rivers, and the vast Mississippi system actually funnels out of the state in three completely different directions, which is a fact most Minnesotans themselves don't know until someone points it out to them. Near the town of Hibbing, not far from that relocated Main Street, sits a low, unremarkable rise called the Laurentian Divide, one of only a small handful of places in North America where three major drainage systems meet. Rain falling on one side runs south down the Mississippi, eventually reaching the Gulf of Mexico. Rain falling on another side runs north through the Red River system into Hudson Bay in Canada. Rain falling on a third side runs east through Lake Superior and the Great Lakes toward the Atlantic by way of the St. Lawrence River. Minnesota is one of the only places on the continent where a person could, in principle, stand within a short walk of water eventually reaching three different oceans. And that's no small part of why the actual headwaters of the Mississippi River sit inside the state at all, at Lake Itasca, where the river that drains most of the middle of the country starts as a stream narrow enough for a person to walk across on a line of stepping stones. That image, a child hopping across the birth of the Mississippi, is almost as iconic in Minnesota as the loon on the license plate, and it belongs to the same larger picture. A state that sits at a rare crossing point of continental water systems, sitting on top of some of the oldest rock those systems have ever crossed. Even confirming that Itasca was the true source took longer than most people assume. And the way it finally got confirmed fits a pattern that keeps resurfacing in this story. European explorers and mapmakers had spent decades arguing over which lake actually fed the Mississippi's start, until the American explorer Henry Schoolcraft finally reached and correctly identified Itasca in 1832, an expedition he could not have completed without an Ojibwe guide named Ozawindib, who already knew exactly where the river began. Schoolcraft got the credit and his name attached to the popular account. The person who actually knew the answer had known it his whole life and simply hadn't been the one anyone thought to ask first. Put all of that geography side by side, and a pattern starts to explain itself. Very few places on the continent sit on some of its oldest exposed crust, carry a fossilized record of the event that oxygenated the planet, mark the meeting point of 3 biomes and 3 ocean-bound watersheds, and were then scraped clean and reshaped by ice within the last several thousand years, all inside one set of state lines. Most of what makes Minnesota geologically unusual isn't any single fact on that list. It's that all of them happen to stack on top of each other in the same place, a rare kind of geological luck. And it's exactly why a slogan as small as 10,000 lakes was always going to undersell what's actually here. That water didn't just carry canoes and taconite freighters. It built a second, quieter economic empire that most people never connect to the mining story at all. Downstream from Lake Itasca, the Mississippi drops over its only true waterfall along its entire length at St. Anthony Falls, right in the middle of what's now downtown Minneapolis. In the late 1800s, that falling water was harnessed to turn millstones, and Minneapolis briefly became the flour milling capital of the entire world, earning the nickname Mill City. Companies with names still recognizable today, Pillsbury and Washburn, later folded into General Mills, built enormous mills right along the riverbank, and in 1878 one of them, the Washburn A Mill, exploded when accumulated flour dust ignited, an explosion powerful enough to level the mill and kill over a dozen workers instantly, a disaster that forced the entire industry to rethink dust ventilation and helped establish some of the earliest industrial safety standards in American milling. The falls that ground that flour are the same river system that starts as a stepping stone stream 200 miles north, and the fortune it built downtown sits on the opposite end of the exact hydrology that made the northern lake country what it is. That milling fortune produced 2 of the most recognizable food brands in the country, and neither one advertises the lake either. General Mills invented Cheerios in 1941 and, 2 decades earlier, created Betty Crocker as a fictional, entirely invented spokesperson, a friendly signature on recipe pamphlets meant to make a giant flour company feel like a helpful neighbor instead of an industrial mill on a hydroelectric river. An hour south, in the town of Austin, a meatpacking company called Hormel introduced a canned spiced ham product in 1937 that it named Spam, a product now sold in dozens of countries and central enough to the town's identity that Austin built an entire museum dedicated to it. A fictional baking mascot and a can of pressed meat product both count in their own strange way as more globally recognized Minnesota exports than the Loon ever managed to be. There's one more piece of that industrial story worth knowing, and it starts, of all places, with a failed mine. In 1902, a group of investors near 2 harbors, right on the North Shore, formed a company to mine what they believed was a valuable deposit of corundum, a hard mineral used to make sandpaper and grinding wheels. They named the company Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing. The mine was a disaster. The mineral deposit turned out to be low-grade and nearly worthless, and the company came close to folding within its first few years. Rather than shut down, the surviving investors pivoted the company toward manufacturing sandpaper and abrasive products directly, using materials shipped in from elsewhere instead of mined locally, and slowly built it into one of the largest manufacturing companies in the world, known today simply by its abbreviation 3M. Scotch tape, Post-it notes, and thousands of industrial products all trace back to a failed corundum mine on the North Shore that never actually produced the mineral it was founded to dig up. The company kept the word mining in its name for well over 100 years after it stopped mining anything at all. A small, permanent fossil of its own origin sitting right there in the letterhead, 3M's more recent history matters here too, in a much less flattering way, and leaving it out would repeat exactly the kind of selective postcard framing the license plate itself is guilty of. For decades, the company manufactured a class of chemicals called PFAS, per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, at facilities in the eastern suburbs of the Twin Cities, chemicals prized for their resistance to heat, water, and grease, that ended up in everything from firefighting foam to food packaging. Those same properties mean the chemicals barely break down in the environment at all. And for years, the company disposed of manufacturing waste in ways that let PFAS compounds seep into the groundwater beneath Oakdale, Cottage Grove, and several other East Metro communities, contaminating drinking water wells that residents had been using for years before the contamination was identified. In 2018, Minnesota's Attorney General reached a settlement with 3M worth $850 million over the damage, one of the largest environmental settlements in the state's history, funding water treatment and natural resource restoration across the affected communities. A company born from a failed mine on that same rock became, more than a century later, the center of one of the state's largest groundwater contamination cases. In the same metro area full of lakes, people swim in every summer without necessarily knowing what's dissolved in the water table underneath their own neighborhood. Before heading back down to the range and into the fight over what happens next there, it's worth returning to that ancient ocean one more time, because the story of the rusting iron didn't end where it started. Once the Great Oxidation Event finished raising atmospheric oxygen to a new baseline, oxygen levels then sat comparatively flat for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, well over 1 billion years that some geologists have only half-jokingly nicknamed the Boring Billion, a period when the ocean's chemistry stabilized and complex, visibly organized life still hadn't appeared. It wasn't until oxygen climbed again, much closer to modern levels, that the fossil record starts showing the first large, complex organisms in the Ediacaran period, followed by the sudden spread of animal body plans in the Cambrian, a few 100 million years further on still. The banded rock under the Mesabi Range captures the opening act of that story, not the ending, a rusted first draft of the air, written more than 1 billion years before anything alive was around to need it. The Twin Cities, 3 hours south of the range, run on an entirely different modern economy, and it's worth naming because the Loon and Lake postcard doesn't include a word of it either. Minneapolis and St. Paul host the headquarters of a strikingly large number of major American companies for a metro area this size, including Target, Best Buy, General Mills, and the health insurer United Health Group, along with a dense cluster of medical device and health technology firms the industry itself calls Medical Alley. A lot of that cluster traces back to one specific event. In 1949, a young engineer named Earl Bakken started a medical equipment repair business out of a garage in northeast Minneapolis, and within a decade, working alongside University of Minnesota heart surgeon Dr. C. Walton Lillehei, Bakken built the first practical wearable or ALB battery-powered external pacemaker, small enough for a patient to walk around wearing rather than being tethered to a wall outlet. That company became Medtronic, still headquartered in the Twin Cities today. And Lillehei's work at the university through the 1950s, including some of the earliest open-heart surgery techniques ever attempted, helped make Minnesota an unlikely global center for cardiac medicine, a reputation that has almost nothing to do with lakes or iron, and almost everything to do with one repair shop and one surgeon deciding to solve a specific, urgent problem. 2 hours south in the mid-sized town of Rochester, a family medical practice started by a doctor named William Worrell Mayo, and his 2 sons in the 1880s grew into the Mayo Clinic, now one of the most respected medical institutions on earth, still headquartered in that same modest-sized Minnesota town rather than in a coastal city, drawing patients from every continent to a place most Americans could not otherwise find on a map. 2 completely independent medical dynasties, born a couple of hours apart, neither one built anywhere near a lake, None of that erased what was happening back on the range, while the Twin Cities were building a medical technology industry. As the taconite jobs kept shrinking through the back half of the 20th century, the state set up a dedicated agency, the Iron Range Resources and Rehabilitation Board, funded directly by a share of the taconite production tax, specifically to reinvest mining revenue into the range's own economic diversification, job training, and small business loans, rather than letting that money simply flow south into the general state budget. It's an imperfect, sometimes politically contested tool, and it hasn't stopped the population decline in towns like Chisholm and Eveleth, but it represents another deliberate human choice layered on top of the geology. Instead of just extracting the rock and letting the towns fend for themselves once the easy ore ran out, the state built a standing mechanism specifically meant to funnel some of that value back into the people living on top of it. The University of Minnesota's original Mines Experiment Station, the same lab where Edmund Davis spent decades perfecting taconite processing, still exists today under a different name, the Natural Resources Research Institute, and it now splits its attention between finding new uses for mining byproducts and researching cleaner ways to extract copper and nickel with less waste and less acid risk. The same institution that saved the range once now trying to help it survive its next chapter without repeating reserve mining's mistakes. Bring the story back up to the range now, because the economic reality up there today looks nothing like the boom years of the Merritt brothers, and it's worth being honest about exactly how it's changed. Iron mining never left. Minnesota still produces the large majority of the country's iron ore. But the number of people it takes to produce that ore has fallen enormously as automation, larger equipment, and more efficient processing have taken over jobs that used to require whole shifts of workers. The range today employs a few thousand people directly in taconite mining, a fraction of the tens of thousands the mines employed at their 1940s peak, even though total production has stayed roughly steady or grown. Much of that falling headcount comes down to specific pieces of equipment doing what used to take a full shift of people. Autonomous, GPS-guided haul trucks now move ore around parts of some pits with no driver in the cab at all, and computer-optimized blasting and crushing schedules have quietly replaced a layer of inspection and scheduling jobs that used to exist purely to keep human judgment in the loop. None of it happened because anyone wanted fewer range families employed. It happened because a truck that never needs a break, a lunch, or a pension is measurably cheaper to run, and that math doesn't care what town it's running through. That's the quiet, unglamorous version of decline that doesn't show up in a headline, jobs disappearing even while the industry itself keeps running. And that gap is a big reason towns like Chisholm and Eveleth have shrunk for decades, even as the pits nearby keep producing ore every single year. Picture two mornings happening at roughly the same latitude, under the same gray range daylight, separated by no more than a few miles. In one, a family from out of state is loading a canoe onto a car roof outside an outfitter in Ely, checking a permit printed the week before, headed into a wilderness quiet enough to hear their own paddle strokes. In the other, a third-generation taconite worker in Eveleth is pulling on steel-toed boots before a shift that starts well before sunrise, checking a different kind of paperwork, a pension statement, a seniority list, a rumor about the next round of layoffs that always seems to be circulating no matter how good production numbers look that quarter. Neither of those two people is wrong about what Minnesota is. They're both right, standing on the same rock, a few miles and a world apart. It's common enough on the range to find that same split running straight through a single family rather than between two strangers. A grandparent who spent 30 years underground or in an open pit. A parent who left for a job in the Twin Cities medical technology sector. And a grandchild who now guides canoe trips out of Ely every summer. 3 generations of the same bloodline standing in 3 completely different relationships to the same rock. Each one quietly convinced their version of Minnesota is the real one. None of them entirely wrong. That squeeze is exactly why the copper and nickel sitting deeper in the same rock formation matters so much to people up there, and it's worth understanding the actual chemistry before getting into the fight over it. Because the chemistry is the whole reason this fight exists in the first place. The Duluth Complex, the mineral-rich rock running along the edge of the Iron Range, doesn't just hold iron. Deeper, and to the east, it holds one of the largest known undeveloped deposits of copper and nickel in the United States, locked into a different kind of mineral structure than taconite. Bound up with sulfide minerals rather than iron oxide. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. Taconite, the iron ore that's been mined here for over a century, doesn't generate much acid when it's crushed and exposed to air and water. Sulfide ore is a different animal chemically. When rock containing sulfide minerals is broken up and left exposed, it can react with air and water to produce sulfuric acid, a process called acid mine drainage, and that acid can pull heavy metals out of the surrounding rock and carry them into groundwater and streams, sometimes for decades after a mine has closed. The chemistry runs through a mineral called pyrite, iron sulfide, common in these copper-nickel-bearing rocks. Left alone and buried, pyrite is stable. Crushed and exposed to air and water, it oxidizes, and naturally occurring bacteria that thrive in exactly that chemical environment actually accelerate the reaction, speeding up sulfuric acid production well beyond what the plain chemistry would manage on its own. The acid then dissolves copper, nickel, and other metals out of the surrounding waste rock and carries them downstream in solution, which is why containing and treating that runoff, potentially for generations after mining ends, sits at the center of every permit application and every legal challenge these projects have faced. None of this is theoretical. Acid mine drainage is documented at sulfide mining sites across the world, and it's the central technical argument at the heart of everything that's happened in northeastern Minnesota over roughly the last 20 years. Geologists who have studied the Duluth Complex describe it as one of the largest known undeveloped copper-nickel resources in the country, big enough by most estimates to support decades of production if it were ever fully developed, which is exactly why both the economic stakes and the environmental stakes keep getting described in the same breath as generational rather than incidental. Regulation has changed since reserve mining was allowed to dump straight into Lake Superior for decades without serious consequence, and it's worth naming that change, rather than pretending nothing has been learned. Minnesota now requires financial assurance, essentially a bond or trust fund, to be set aside before a mine like NorthMet can even begin operating, specifically so the state and not the public ends up paying for cleanup and long-term water treatment if the company that built the mine goes bankrupt or simply walks away once the ore runs out, the exact scenario that turned Butte's Berkeley Pit into a permanent taxpayer liability. Whether the amount required is actually enough to cover water treatment that could run for decades or centuries is itself one of the more technical, least glamorous fights buried inside the permitting process, and it's arguably more consequential than almost anything else being argued over. Two separate projects sit at the middle of this. One is the NorthMet project, proposed by a company that's gone through a couple of ownership changes and now operates as New Range Copper Nickel, planned near the towns of Hoyt Lakes and Babbitt. Its water drains toward the Partridge River, into the St. Louis River, and eventually into Lake Superior, following roughly the same path reserve mining's tailings once did. It's gone through years of permitting, legal challenges, and court reversals, and as of now it remains contested rather than settled, with unresolved questions specifically about how it would handle the long-term risk of sulfate and heavy metal contamination downstream. The environmental review alone, the formal impact statement process required before permits can even be considered, stretched across more than a decade and produced thousands of pages of technical analysis, drawing tens of thousands of public comments along the way, which gives some sense of just how contested both the science and the stakes are. The second, and the one tied more directly to the state's most protected wilderness, is the Twin Metals Project, a proposed underground copper-nickel mine near the town of Ely. Its water doesn't drain toward Lake Superior at all. It drains north, through the South Cowichan River, directly into the Rainy River watershed, and from there, into the Boundary Waters Canoe Area wilderness itself. Twin Metals proposes to mine underground rather than as an open pit, tunneling into the ore body instead of stripping the surface off it, specifically to keep the mine's physical footprint as small as possible this close to protected wilderness. Underground mining doesn't remove the acid drainage risk, since the broken sulfide rock still has to come out and go somewhere. But it does mean nothing here will ever look like the mile-wide open pits further south on the range. New Range Copper Nickel, the company now behind NorthMet, is itself a joint venture between two large international mining companies, Glencore and Teck Resources, after years of PolyMet Mining running the project on its own, under different financial backing. And the tribal governments most directly affected by both projects have names worth knowing, rather than treating as a faceless category. The Fond du Lac Band, the Bois Fort Band, and the Grand Portage Band, all part of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, each holding reservation land in or near the watersheds these mines would drain into, and each an active, formal party in the permitting fights, not a symbolic bystander. Sit in on one of those public hearings, and the split running through this whole story stops being an abstraction. A retired miner stands up to talk about his pension, and the friends he watched leave the range once the mill jobs thinned out. A tribal elder speaks about a rice bed her family has harvested for generations and asks, plainly, why anyone should trust a company's water models over the lake's own track record. A current taconite worker talks about wanting his kids to be able to stay without driving 3 hours for work. An outfitter describes losing a summer's worth of bookings the moment a permit decision makes the news, in either direction. Nobody at that microphone is speaking in the abstract language of a policy brief. They're describing their own kitchen table, and the room holds all of it at once, agreeing on almost nothing except how much the outcome actually matters to the person standing there. The Boundary Waters isn't just another pretty lake district. It's a federally protected wilderness covering more than 1 million acres along the Minnesota-Ontario border, threaded with over 1,000 lakes and rivers, and it's canoe-only, meaning no motors, no roads, nothing but paddling and portaging between one lake and the next. It draws well over 100,000 visitors a year, most of them coming through outfitters based in and around Ely, a town whose modern economy runs almost entirely on people coming to experience exactly the kind of untouched, quiet, water-laced wilderness that the original 10,000 Lakes slogan was always trying to sell in miniature. It is, in a very real sense, the purest, most concentrated version of the Loon and Lake postcard itself, and it sits directly downstream of the deposit everyone is fighting over. Much of the Boundary Waters sits on rock that will feel familiar by now. A large share of it is exposed Canadian Shield granite and greenstone, part of the same ancient basement rock family as the Morton Gneiss far to the south, some of it well over 2 billion years old in its own right. Worn smooth by the same glaciers that carved the lake basins everywhere else in the state. A canoeist portaging between lakes up there is walking across bare rock nearly as old as the iron formation feeding the fight over what happens to the watershed around it, whether or not any guidebook mentions it. The wilderness draws a specific kind of person, and Ely has produced more than its share of them. The polar explorer Will Steger, who led the first confirmed dog sled expedition to the North Pole without resupply in 1986 and later led a full traverse of Antarctica, has been based near Ely for decades, and the town still supports outfitters and gear makers, including a Mukluk and winter clothing company built on techniques developed for exactly that kind of expedition. Ely calls itself the canoe capital of the world without much argument from anyone, and the wilderness quota system the Forest Service uses to manage it. A limited number of permits issued per entry point per day during the busy season exists specifically to keep the place from being loved into ruin by its own popularity. A deliberate, ongoing act of restraint layered on top of a landscape people already fought hard to protect once. Ely's outfitting economy isn't a rounding error in all this either. Dozens of small, family-run canoe outfitters and resorts operate out of the town and the surrounding area, most of them employing seasonal staff who return year after year, built entirely around a wilderness that, if it were ever seriously degraded, wouldn't come back on any timeline a business owner could plan around. That's the economic argument on the water side of this fight, stated as plainly as the mining side's argument about jobs and pensions. An industry that depends on the resource staying exactly as it is indefinitely, set against an industry that depends on changing it. It's a jarring thing that a state this size holds both extremes within a single afternoon's drive. A motor-free wilderness, where the loudest sound most days is a loon calling across still water, and 3 hours south, a metro area with skyscrapers, an international airport, and one of the densest concentrations of Fortune 500 headquarters in the country, connected by nothing more dramatic than a single highway running the length of it. The Boundary Waters and the Superior National Forest around it hold onto something most of the lower 48 lost a long time ago: a wild population of gray wolves that never disappeared. While wolves were hunted, poisoned, and trapped to virtual extinction across almost every other part of the lower 48 states by the middle of the 20th century, a population held on in the remote forests of northeastern Minnesota, protected in part by sheer distance from most human settlement, and it became the source population that later reintroduction efforts in places like Yellowstone eventually drew on to help rebuild wolf populations elsewhere. The International Wolf Center, based in Ely, right next to the wilderness those wolves still roam, exists specifically because this corner of the state never lost what most of the country had already erased. Not everything in that same ecosystem is holding steady, though, and it's worth being honest about that instead of only celebrating the wolves. Minnesota's moose population in the northeastern part of the state has fallen sharply since the middle of the 2000s, and wildlife researchers who track it point to a warming climate as a major driver, not through heat alone, but through what warmer winters let survive. Winter ticks, which used to die off in serious cold snaps, are surviving in far greater numbers on milder winters, infesting individual moose by the tens of thousands and weakening them badly enough to affect their odds of survival and reproduction. A parasite called brainworm, carried harmlessly by white-tailed deer, but often fatal to moose, spreads more easily as deer populations expand northward into moose range on the back of shorter, gentler winters. It's a quiet, unglamorous kind of environmental pressure. Not a spill or a single dramatic event, just a slow shift in which winters used to be cold enough to keep a threat in check and increasingly aren't. Playing out in the same forests where the wolves are, technically, a conservation success story. Winter itself is still the single most defining physical fact of life in this state. Sirius sells em yelbenasenduming, even as it slowly, measurably changes. The town of Tower, not far from the wolf country and the edge of the Boundary Waters, holds Minnesota's official record for the coldest temperature ever recorded here, 60 degrees below zero. Set in February of 1996, cold enough that exposed skin can suffer frostbite within minutes. That record isn't just a historical relic either. In the closing days of January 2019, a polar vortex event pushed wind chills across much of the state to 70 degrees below zero or worse, cold enough that the Postal Service suspended mail delivery, schools across Minnesota closed for days, and doctors warned that exposed skin could freeze in 5 minutes or less. Winter here isn't a mood. It's a recurring, measurable event with its own casualty count most years. The same state also sits close enough to the northern edge of Tornado Alley to see genuine, severe weather most summers. Hail, straight-line wind events, and occasional tornado outbreaks among them. So the postcard's mild, mosquito and loon version of a July evening quietly skips the fact that this same latitude produces both some of the coldest wind chill warnings and some of the more violent summer storm systems in the country, sometimes within the same calendar year. And yet winter isn't only endured up here. It's turned into its own economy and its own festival season. Every January, the town of Brainerd hosts what organizers call the largest ice fishing contest on Earth, drawing well over 10,000 anglers out onto a frozen lake in a single morning, drilling holes through ice thick enough to drive a truck across, raising money for local charities in the process. That's the same cold that keeps this culture leaning so hard on cooperation. It's just been turned deliberately into something people show up for on purpose. Spring arrives here as an actual event rather than a gradual shift, and lake towns across the state mark it with informal betting pools, guessing the exact day a specific lake's ice will finally break apart, a tradition serious enough in some towns that the guest closest to the real ice-out date wins a real prize. It's a strange thing to build a shared calendar ritual around watching frozen water fail, but it captures something true about how closely this culture still tracks its own climate, one lake, one winter, one thaw at a time. Even that tradition is starting to feel the same pressure the moose are feeling. Organizers of major ice fishing tournaments across the upper Midwest, Brainerd's included, have had to shorten seasons, shift dates, or add extra safety checks in recent years as reliably thick ice arrives later and leaves earlier than it used to. The same warming trend showing up in a completely different part of the calendar than the one affecting the wolves and the deer. The bird doing most of the work on that license plate deserves its own beat too, because it isn't just a mascot. The common loon, Minnesota's official state bird, needs exactly the kind of water this whole story keeps circling back to: clear, quiet, undisturbed lakes with healthy fish populations and shorelines calm enough for a nest built practically at the waterline. Loons are unusually sensitive to both water clarity and human disturbance, and that sensitivity is exactly why wildlife biologists treat them as a living indicator of a lake's overall health. A bird that simply stops nesting successfully once water gets too murky, too developed, or too polluted to support it. That same contamination pathway, sulfate and heavy metals moving slowly through a chain of connected lakes, doesn't stay confined to fish and wild rice, if it ever happens. It moves up a food chain that ends, eventually, at the exact bird printed on the license plate. The postcard and the pollution risk aren't two separate stories being told side by side. They're the same story about the same animal, told from opposite ends. The regulatory fight over that deposit has bounced back and forth across 3 different presidential administrations, and the whiplash itself tells you how unresolved this actually is. Starting in 2016, the Obama administration's Forest Service and Interior Department launched a formal environmental review and a proposed 20-year mineral withdrawal for the watershed feeding the Boundary Waters, citing the risk sulfide mining posed to a wilderness with almost no capacity to flush out contamination once it entered the system. In 2018, the incoming Trump administration's Interior Department canceled that study before it was finished and, the following year, renewed the mineral leases that Twin Metals needed to proceed, reversing course entirely. Then, in 2022, the Biden administration's Interior Department canceled those same leases again, and in January of 2023, it finished what the Obama administration had started, withdrawing roughly 225,000 acres of the watershed from new mineral leasing for 20 years. Twin Metals and its supporters have pushed back hard, arguing the science doesn't support a blanket ban and that the decision was driven more by shifting politics than by an engineering assessment specific to their actual mine plan. And they're not wrong that the decision has already flipped once and could flip again the next time the administration changes. That fight isn't finished. It's been reversed twice in less than a decade, and everyone involved knows a third reversal is entirely possible. It would be easy and dishonest to frame this as a simple story of greedy companies against noble defenders of nature. And that's not what's actually happening on the ground. The people who want this mining to go forward aren't cartoon villains. Many of them are the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the Finnish and Slovenian and Italian families who came to dig the first iron out of the Mesabi Range, living in towns where mining has been the only reliable path to a stable, well-paying job for 5 generations, and where automation has already cut the number of workers needed to run a taconite operation, while the amount of ore coming out of the ground has stayed roughly level or even grown. Copper and nickel aren't niche materials either. They're central to the electric motors, batteries, and wiring that the entire push toward cleaner energy technology depends on. And a domestically mined supply is a serious policy argument, not a talking point invented to sound reasonable. That argument already has a concrete example attached to it. A separate nickel project at Tamarack, west of the main Duluth complex deposits run by a company called Talon Metals, signed a supply agreement with Tesla to provide nickel for electric vehicle batteries, a deal explicitly framed around reducing American dependence on nickel refined overseas. Whatever a person thinks about sulfide mining in Minnesota, the material is already headed toward exactly the industry its supporters say it is. People on the range aren't wrong to want a future for their kids that doesn't require moving to the Twin Cities. There's a political layer to this, too, and it's shifted in ways that surprise people who still picture the range as a Democratic stronghold by default. Minnesota's Democratic Farmer Labor Party, the DFL, exists at all because of a 1944 merger between the National Democratic Party and Minnesota's own Farmer Labor Party, a party that grew directly out of the same union and cooperative culture built by miners and farmers across places like the Range. For most of the 20th century, Iron Range communities were about as reliably Democratic as any place in the country. Over the last decade or so, a meaningful share of those same communities have shifted toward Republican candidates, driven largely by exactly this fight: frustration with environmental permitting delays, trade and energy policy, and a sense among longtime mining families that the party their grandparents built no longer prioritizes their jobs the way it once did. It's a genuine realignment, still playing out election by election, rooted in the same tension found everywhere else in this account: an old industrial identity meeting a newer set of national priorities it doesn't always fit inside. The DFL's own most famous figure, Hubert Humphrey, started as mayor of Minneapolis, helped broker the 1944 merger that created the party, and went on to become vice president, and one of the loudest congressional voices for civil rights legislation in the 1960s. A legacy built on the same coalition of union labor and farm cooperatives now quietly fraying along the range. And the people opposing the mines aren't wrong either. The Boundary Waters watershed has essentially no way to dilute or flush out a contamination event the way a faster-moving river system might, because water moves through that chain of connected lakes slowly, lake to lake, over years rather than days. Once heavy metals get into a system that circulates that slowly, the exposure can persist for a very long time, and the tourism economy those lakes support, along with the treaty-protected hunting, fishing, and gathering rights, the Mille Lacs Supreme Court case affirmed back in 1999, are not abstractions. Wild rice, known in Ojibwe as manumin, grows in shallow lakes and slow river systems across this same region, and it's both a staple food and a resource carrying deep cultural and spiritual significance, harvested by hand from canoes in a tradition that predates the state of Minnesota by centuries. The traditional harvest itself is worth picturing clearly. 2 people work each canoe, one poling quietly through the rice bed, the other using a pair of smooth cedar sticks to gently bend the tall grass stalks over the canoe and knock the ripe kernels loose, never cutting the plant, leaving it standing to reseed the bed for next year. Back on shore, the harvested rice still has to be parched over low heat to loosen the tough outer hull, then hulled by treading on it gently, a step traditionally done in a small pit lined with a clean hide, before the loosened chaff is tossed into the air from a birch bark tray, and the wind carries the light husks away, leaving the heavier grain behind. It's slow, quiet, physically demanding work from start to finish. Done across the same weeks, Ojibwe communities still mark on their own calendar as the wild rice moon, on water that has to stay clean for the rice to grow at all. A wild rice lake in September has its own unmistakable look from inside a canoe, tall golden green stalks standing chest height above the waterline, dense enough in places that paddling through feels more like pushing through a field than crossing open water, the whole bed hissing gently against the hull with every stroke. It's about as far from a sulfide mining photograph on the evening news as a landscape can look. And that distance is exactly the point. Nobody arguing to protect that lake is arguing about an abstraction. They're arguing about a specific sound and a specific color of water they can picture with their eyes closed. Wild rice is also unusually sensitive to sulfate pollution, which is exactly why the state set a specific water quality standard, 10 milligrams per liter of sulfate, all the way back in 1973, specifically to protect the lakes and rivers where wild rice grows. That standard has been at the center of its own separate, ongoing legal and regulatory fight for years, tangled up with exactly the same sulfide mining question, because any operation that raises sulfate levels in these watersheds runs straight into a rule, written explicitly to protect this exact resource. Mining industry groups have argued the 50-year-old standard is outdated and based on incomplete science. Tribal governments and environmental groups have argued it's one of the only concrete legal protections Manoomin has left. Both sides have spent years and a great deal of money in front of state regulators arguing over a single number, 10 milligrams per liter, because that number is functionally a decision about whether this specific plant survives in this specific water. There's a useful, sobering comparison sitting 1,000 miles to the west, in Butte, Montana, a town whose entire 20th century looked a lot like the Iron Ranges, built on a single enormous metal deposit, this one copper instead of iron, mined for decades by the Anaconda Copper Mining Company until the richest ore ran out and the company walked away. What Anaconda left behind, an open pit called the Berkeley Pit, filled slowly with groundwater that reacted with exposed sulfide rock, exactly the way the acid mine drainage process works, turning the pit into a lake of water so acidic and metal-laden that a flock of migrating snow geese that landed on it in the 1990s died within days, and the entire site is now one of the largest and most expensive Superfund cleanups in the country, a cleanup with essentially no end date, because the water has to be treated forever. Nobody on the Iron Range needs a lecture about Butte. People up there know that story. It's part of why the fight over Twin Metals and NorthMet isn't an abstract environmental debate to the people living closest to it. It's a specific, well-documented outcome they've watched happen to another mining town just like theirs, and it shapes how seriously both sides take the argument. Almost none of this reaches most of the country as anything more than a passing headline, and that's worth noticing too. National coverage tends to flatten the whole thing into a single sentence, a mine versus a wilderness, because that version fits in a Chiron and this one doesn't. The actual fight involves 3 different watersheds, 2 different companies, 3 federal administrations that have each reversed the last one, a 1973 sulfate rule, a 1999 Supreme Court case, and thousands of people on both sides who have spent their entire adult lives inside the argument, rather than reading about it once and moving on. A story this layered doesn't survive being compressed for a headline. It only survives being told at the length it actually takes, and that alone explains why so few people outside Minnesota know any of it. There's one more hidden layer, smaller than all the others, sitting quietly in the shape of the state itself. Look closely at a map of Minnesota's northern border, and there's an odd little notch poking up into Canada, a piece of Minnesota called the Northwest Angle, the northernmost point in the entire lower 48 states, cut off from the rest of the state by land and reachable by road only by driving through Canada first. It exists because of a mapping mistake. The 1783 treaty that set the border between the new United States and British Canada relied on maps that misunderstood the geography of the Lake of the Woods region, assuming a boundary line that, once the area was actually surveyed decades later, produced this strange, isolated pocket instead of a clean border. Nobody designed the Northwest Angle on purpose. It's a fossil of an 18th century cartographer's best guess, still sitting there on every accurate map of the state. And most Minnesotans have never been anywhere near it. The handful of people who actually live there, in a settlement called Angle Inlet, still have to cross an international border just to reach the rest of their own state by road. And for years, the honor system used at the unstaffed crossing simply asked drivers to phone customs officials from a roadside booth and describe themselves, rather than requiring a staffed checkpoint for a few dozen residents in the middle of nowhere. Most Minnesotans, in fact, don't experience the lake identity through a cabin at all. Minneapolis alone contains a chain of urban lakes, Lake Harriet, Lake of the Isles, and the lake locals now call Bidimaka, threaded through the middle of the city with paved paths circling each one, packed most summer evenings with runners, dog walkers, and people paddleboarding after work rather than fishing off a dock 2 hours north. That last lake's name is its own small piece of this same story. For more than a century, it was called Lake Calhoun, after John C. Calhoun, a 19th century vice president and outspoken defender of slavery, who never once set foot in Minnesota. In 2018, and again after a court fight that settled the matter in 2020, the state restored the lake's original Dakota name, Bidimaka, meaning White Earth Lake. It's a small local example of a pattern found again and again across this state's history, a name imposed from outside covering over an older, more accurate one, until somebody finally does the work of restoring it. So here's the actual shape of the thing being hidden underneath the postcard. There's no monster in it, and no cover-up either. It's a genuine, unresolved conflict between two truths that both come directly out of the same 2-billion-year-old rock. That rock is the reason towns on the Iron Range exist at all, the reason immigrant families found a foothold in this country, the reason the United States had enough steel to win a world war, and the reason those same towns are now fighting for an economic future in an era when the easy version of that industry no longer exists. The exact same rock, a few miles east and a few hundred feet deeper, is also the reason the purest expression of Minnesota's water identity, the wilderness that the 10,000 Lakes slogan was always secretly describing, is currently sitting under a federal withdrawal that has already been reversed once and could be reversed again. Both of those things are true. Both of them come from the same source. Neither one is fake, and neither one cancels the other out. That's an uncomfortable fact to hold on to because most stories like this want a villain, and this one doesn't offer a clean one. A miner in Eveleth whose family has worked that rock for 4 generations isn't wrong to want his kids to be able to stay. An outfitter in Ely whose entire business depends on the boundary waters staying pristine isn't wrong to be terrified of what a contamination event 30 years from now would do to that water and to the wild rice lakes Ojibwe families have harvested for far longer than Minnesota has existed as a state. Neither one of them chose the geology. They just inherited it, the way everyone standing on that rock right now inherited it. And they're the ones actually living inside the argument everyone else mostly only hears about in passing headlines. Something else is worth naming here because it's part of the same picture, and it usually gets treated as a totally separate story. Minnesota has an outsized reputation for a specific kind of social behavior, the thing everyone calls Minnesota nice, the instinct toward relentless politeness, conflict avoidance, and small, quiet acts of communal generosity. Researchers who study community trust and civic participation have consistently ranked the Upper Midwest, and Minnesota specifically, among the most socially cohesive regions in the country, measured through things like voter turnout, charitable giving, and rates of volunteering. That reputation didn't come out of nowhere, and it isn't just a personality quirk. Winters here are dangerous, cold enough to kill a person exposed without shelter in under an hour. And across more than 100 years, the small towns scattered across this rock, mining towns especially, survived those winters and those boom-bust mining cycles by leaning hard on cooperation, because isolation in a place like that could actually get someone killed. The credit union movement took deep root here. So did the agricultural cooperative model, most visibly in Land O'Lakes, founded by a group of Minnesota dairy farmers in 1921 who decided that pooling resources beat competing each other into the ground. Even the state's famous politeness, in other words, isn't separate from the geology and the economic history. It's a cultural adaptation that grew directly out of surviving on top of it, generation after generation, through winters and layoffs that could just as easily have turned neighbors against each other instead. It's worth being honest that this reputation has real limits because holding it up without any complication would be its own kind of postcard. Minnesota consistently ranks among the states with the widest economic gaps between white residents and residents of color, in measures like homeownership and household income, disparities that researchers who study the state's economy describe as some of the starkest in the country despite its overall wealth and low unemployment. That contradiction, a state that regularly lands near the top of national quality of life and median income rankings, while also carrying some of the widest racial gaps in those same categories, is its own small version of the postcard problem, an average that looks excellent from a distance and hides real unevenness the moment you look at who the average is actually describing. And in 2020, Minneapolis became the center of a moment the entire world watched, after George Floyd was killed by a police officer during an arrest, an event that led to that officer's criminal conviction and to months of protest and unrest across the city and far beyond it. Neither of those facts erases the genuine cooperative culture built across generations on the range and across the rest of the state. But leaving out the part where that politeness has real limits and real exceptions would be doing exactly what the license plate does, showing the flattering angle and calling it the whole picture. There's a wider pattern buried in all of this too, one that shows up anywhere a place gets built around a single extractive resource. Mining towns everywhere, from Appalachian coal country to copper towns like Butte, tend to follow the same arc. A sudden boom that pulls in workers from everywhere, decades of hard, dangerous labor that builds real community even as it enriches people far away. And then a slow squeeze as the easy version of the resource runs out, forcing either painful reinvention or slow decline. Minnesota's Iron Range is one of the rarer examples where reinvention actually worked, largely because one metallurgist spent half a century solving a specific engineering problem, and the state backed the investment with a specific piece of tax policy. That's not an accident of geography. That's a choice, made by identifiable people at an identifiable moment. And it's a large part of why the range still has an economy at all, instead of joining the long list of extraction towns that simply emptied out once the good ore ran dry, towns like the ones scattered across the emptied-out corners of Butte's own home state. All of which brings this back to that dock at 5 in the morning, the loon calling across flat water, because that image hasn't actually changed. It's still true. The mist still sits on the lake. The coffee's still warm in the thermos. What's changed is what a person standing there now knows about the ground underneath their feet and the water in front of them. That lake is sitting in a scar cut by ice, that melted roughly 12,000 years ago on top of rock that recorded the moment the ocean first rusted as it filled with breathable oxygen 2 billion years before that, on top of rock older than animal life itself, well past 3 billion years old in places, in a state whose modern towns exist because immigrant families dug that rusted rock out of the ground for a century and are now watching a different, deeper layer of that same rock become the center of a fight over what this place gets to be next. None of that is hidden in a sinister sense. It's just too large, too slow, and too geological to fit on a license plate. The postcard was never lying. It just never had room to tell you what you were actually looking at. It's worth pausing on how differently this could have gone, too, if the order of discovery had simply been reversed. Copper and nickel sit deeper in the Duluth complex than the iron does, and that depth difference alone explains why iron got found and mined first, by prospectors walking the surface with a dip needle a full century before anyone drilled deep enough to map the sulfide layer underneath it. If the copper-nickel deposit had been the shallow one instead, this state's entire 20th century might have opened with an acid drainage fight instead of a taconite success story. And there might never have been a stable, government-backed industry solid enough to fund an agency like the Iron Range Resources and Rehabilitation Board in the first place. The order the rock happened to be found in, not any plan anyone made, shaped which version of this story got a century head start. None of this is unique to Minnesota either, even if the specific details are. Nevada's lithium deposits, Arizona copper reserves sitting near tribal land, and a long list of other domestic mineral finds the country will need for the same clean energy transition are running into versions of this exact argument. Jobs and minerals weighed against water, treaty rights, and wilderness. Minnesota just happens to be running that argument earlier and more visibly than most, on ground that already carries a century of mining history underneath it, which makes it about as close to a preview as the rest of the country is going to get. There's a way to hold all of that without flattening it into a single lesson, and it starts by admitting how strange it is to be a temporary, decades-long visitor standing on top of something billions of years old. Every person who has ever built a dock, mined a pit, harvested a stand of wild rice, or driven past a roadside quarry without looking twice has done it inside a window of time so short, measured against the rock underneath them, that it barely registers as a moment at all. That's not a reason to feel small in a defeated way. It's closer to the opposite. The rock did not ask to be shaped into a state, an economy, or an argument. People did that, generation after generation, choosing what to dig, what to protect, what to rebuild, and what to leave alone. And they're still choosing right now, in meetings in St. Paul and in kitchens in Ely and in tribal council chambers on the Fond du Lac Reservation, exactly the way the Merritts once chose to borrow too much, and Edmund Davis chose to keep testing a grinding process nobody had asked him to perfect, and voters once chose to lock a tax rate into their own state constitution just to keep a dying industry alive a little longer. None of the open threads in this particular argument are closed yet either. Litigation over NorthMet's permits is still working through Minnesota's courts as this is being written. The 20-year federal withdrawal protecting the Boundary Waters watershed doesn't expire until the 2040s, but it can be challenged or reversed by executive action well before then, the way it already has been once. The state's sulfate standard for wild rice waters is still under active regulatory review. Every one of those processes will keep moving long after today, decided by people who live inside the argument every day, rather than by anyone who hears about it once from outside the state and moves on. So the next time you see that image, the lake at dawn, the loon, the dock, the whole quiet, friendly, blue and green idea of Minnesota, it's worth remembering what's actually underneath it. Not a hidden monster, not a conspiracy, just 3.5 billion years of rock, a rusted record of the planet learning to breathe, a river system that splits toward 3 different oceans, an industrial economy that built and then nearly broke 100 small towns, and also, almost by accident, one of the largest manufacturers in the world, a bird on the license plate that will only nest where the water stays as clean as the picture claims it is, and a live, unresolved argument about whether the same rock gets touched again. That's a state that's been holding an enormous story quietly, under a very small, very pretty picture, the entire time. And it's still deciding right now, in real towns, with real people, how the next chapter of that story gets written. None of this requires a plane ticket to go see for yourself either. The Morton Gneiss Outcrop is a public roadside stop. The Hull Rust Overlook has a parking lot and a gift shop. Split Rock Lighthouse takes visitors year-round, and Itasca still lets anyone walk the stepping stones across the start of the Mississippi. The whole layered argument sits out in the open the entire time, for anyone willing to read the state as something more than a backdrop. So here's the question to chew on now that the postcard has a little more written on the back of it. If you had to choose right now between the jobs on the range and the water in the wilderness, assuming you truly couldn't protect both, which one would you protect and why? Say where you land in the comments, because that same argument is playing out in St. Paul right now. If the rock under the loon surprised you, a like helps, and subscribing means you're here for whichever way this actually gets decided.